Take command, Logan Paulson there, Craig Hoffman here, and it is mailbag time. And Logan, we're actually going to go callback style to the last mailbag. You talked about how you've taken some things. This feels actually very appropriate as they're getting ready to ban the tush push because in part it's a rugby play. But you talked about how you looked at combat sports, you looked at rugby, you looked at plenty of other sports to help train yourself and to train the guys that you train that are in the league. And so Tristan Gregory 2378 actually left a YouTube comment and said, can Logan expand on some of the things he's taken from rugby and adapted for football training? Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, there's two main things that I've taken. The number one most important thing is how they condition tackling. So like, and I think the NFL has like kind of looked at that model and said like, how do we adapt like obviously safer tackling practices? So like when I was with the Falcons in 2017, they had rugby coaches come out and teach tackling, like, you know, kind of chasing the backside hip, how to gather, like staying square, like where my head, like mainly where my head should be. And then I think when you look at how rugby teams drill tackling, they do a lot of tackling on the bag, right? In the off season, like high off season. Like I'm talking it's 3 weeks removed from season. Like they're doing bag work to tackle. And I thought like that's a really good way to do it because you're kind of reinforcing positions, you're reinforcing patterns, you're reinforcing contact, but you're doing it on the bag, right? And so you get your buddy to hold the bag and they have this really like comprehensive system of teaching tackling. They have this really comprehensive system of executing tackling. So much like with the MMA stuff, I was like, that was a big inspiration for me for my current training to basically be like, hey, like we can get tackling done earlier in the off season. We just have to decrease the intensity because the position, the spacing, the timing is all relevant. We just decrease the intensity of it and finding ways to decrease that intensity. Like rugby's got a really excellent roadmap of that. And so then the other thing schematically that I really enjoy in watching in rugby is their ability to utilize the lateral. So I'm always kind of thinking, you know, when I coach high school football, for example, is there a way to bring this to the forefront of that? And that's essentially what triple option football is, right? It's essentially a rugby play, right? You're trying to get a 2-on-1 at some point on the
Don't
perimeter.
say that, Logan. They'll ban it.
But and I think that's another kind of, again, the more my son plays rugby, the more I watch rugby, the more the tush push is so anti-rugby. Anything you do in rugby, it's crazy. Like in a scrum, like you fit up and you're like locked in and there's like a very specific timing and everything to it. Like the tush push is a football play, 100%. Like there's nothing like just to be clear. But so that's something schematically I'm always looking at with rugby is how can you take what they do from a pitch standpoint, some of the plays that they design in terms of like creating those 2-on-1s, like can I get those same patterns to develop for football? And I do think from a spacing standpoint, it's really, really interesting. Now with rugby, because everyone touches the ball all the time, it's easier to get to some of those laterals. Like in football, it takes a lot of time, a lot of sweat equity. There's a lot of sweat equity to get there, but those are definitely some things that I've taken from rugby in terms of training.
It's funny too because rugby, it's part of the game. Football, everyone is super risk averse. Like football coaches are incredibly conservative when it comes to putting the ball in the air. And so we want the short passing game. This is why we run the football because the risk level is theoretically a lot lower. And so the idea that we're going to pitch the ball all over the place feels like it would just give most coaches in the NFL or at all levels of football a heart attack. But there probably is opportunity there.
It gives me anxiety, but I think also just like in terms of just even a simpler version is just like how they get to 2-on-1s, like because they do different stuff, right? They kind of have different setups to get there. And so again, like if you are running some type of RPO with a pitch element, like it doesn't always have to be like over the top, big arc. Like there could be someone coming underneath. You could have a double underneath kind of working to the perimeter. So I think that's something that I've really looked at quite a bit and something that you do draw inspiration from. Like when you're designing plays, you're like, oh, we could get to that. Like, and it's not, you know, pitch, run for a touchdown. It's like just the positioning of the receiver in relation to the back. Like we can create conflict on a perimeter defender with that pattern that they've used in rugby for, 50 years.
For sure. Real quick on the tush push. By the time this comes out, it may be banned. I'm actually in favor of banning it, but not for the reasons that have been stated. One, as you mentioned, it's actually not a rugby play. It is a football play, but it's a football play that's so clearly designed based off the current rules for the offense. It's just like the offense has enough rules advantages. Defensive, you can't push defensively. You're not supposed to. Offensively, you can. That seems cheap. And like that to me should be the thing. And like it used to be that you couldn't push an offensive player with the ball.
Right.
And just if you reinstitute that, then it's fine. It's just a quarterback sneak. The Eagles will still be better at it than everyone else because Jalen Hurts still squats 600 pounds and their offensive line is great. But to me, like, stop lying about the injury stuff, which is not remotely proven out in the data. And you can always be like, look, it's not yet. All it's going to take is one catastrophic. Sure, fine. That's football. But there's clearly not an elevated risk because it's never happened. Quit calling it a rugby play because it's not. Just say it's completely unfair for the defense, and we think the offense has enough advantage, and we'd like to make the games more competitive. Just say that, and then ban it, and move on. Like, be adults about it.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that you'd see after that is like if I'm not pushing the ball carrier, like I can just have those two backs push the guards. Like there's ways around the rules, you know what I mean? But like I actually like the play. I think it's well executed. I think it's a good design. I think it's annoying as heck. So stay out of 4th and short. Like that's the goal, right? If you're defensively, like let's get that done. And the fact that it's not really repeatable. Like I mean, Buffalo does a pretty good job with it. Obviously, Philly does a good job with it, but other teams have tried to do this with way less success. So obviously, there's a technical element to it that I think people often overlook. You know, like people have tried to do this with other teams, and it's not gone as nearly as well. So for me, like they've found a wrinkle, they've found something they're good at, they spend time, they invest time in it, and they've gotten really good at executing it. So like that is ultimately what football is. So I understand I definitely understand what you're saying. And if they got rid of it, I'm not like, oh, boo-hoo, they got rid of it. Like, fine, move on. But I do think I think there's a schematic element that's pretty fantastic. So
yeah, no, I'm not like gung-ho about it. I'm fine either way. But I think to your point, like you got to stay out of 4th and short. And also like, you know, for as much crap as Nick Sirianni gets, and sometimes there is the question of like, what does Nick Sirianni do? The aggressiveness to just be like, I don't care if we're at our own 30. Like, we're going to get this. We're going for it.
Yes.
And like, there is call it analytics, call it whatever element of like just understanding the true risk reward ratio of that. Nick Sirianni deserves a lot of credit for that. All right. Speaking of the people that would have to stop the tush push or the quarterback sneak, we have a D-line question, Logan, from our guy Stephen Kogan, who hosted that trivia game that made us look like fools a couple of years ago.
Oh, that's right.
So hi, Stephen. We still haven't forgiven you, but that's okay because it was genuinely really, really funny. And it was for a great cause as well. And then we got a couple of draft questions. But Steven writes in, hey, Craig, here's a D-line question. Well, everyone assumes the Commanders will probably get an edge rusher in the 1st or 2nd round or even a good vet in the post-draft free agency. What if they don't? In that scenario, who do you and Logan think would be their D-line in most pass rush situations, mainly who'd be the edge rushers? I currently don't see an obvious choice, but I'd like to hear which guys you think they'd play. My guess, Dorrance Armstrong, Duran Payne, or Javon Kinlaw, Johnny Newton, Dietrich Wise, or Jacob Martin. It's not awful, but I think everyone would prefer to see more juice on the edge, and I think most analysts felt edge rusher wasn't Luvu's strength. Thanks, Stephen. Pass rush, key 3rd down, Logan. Who you throwing out there?
Yeah, so I think Dorrance Armstrong did a really nice job with that last year when he was healthy. I think Jazan is a guy that I think you want to get on the field. I think Kinlaw, again, like we talked about him quite a bit, and Duran. So you have 3 guys on the interior. Maybe you bump one of them to the perimeter. And people say, oh, like you lose some of the pass rush juice. But I will say there are power rushers that do a great job collapsing the pocket that are disruptive to the quarterback. And I think it's important to remember that tackles do so much, like offensive tackles in the NFL do so much specific prep for edge rushers. They look at hand placement, they look at all this stuff, and they're not used to always kind of dealing with bigger body edge rushers. And so I do think there was times last year where like Holmes, for example, on the perimeter, who's like a 285-pound guy, like he wouldn't get a clean, quick win, but he's creating a compression of the pocket in a way that I think is pretty nice. So there's that. And I also think, don't forget about Jean-Baptiste, man. I think when he had his opportunities to rush the passer last year, showed tremendous length, showed tremendous power, and again, was able to compress the pocket in a nice way. So I think people think, oh, it's got to look like TJ Watt, or it's got to look like, Crosby, from Las Vegas. And obviously those guys are extremely dynamic. But I also think there's like when I watch Pittsburgh, for example, like they do a great job. Obviously, TJ Watt is special, but the other guys do a great job of rushing as a unit, and they compress the pocket in a nice way and create tons of pressure that doesn't necessarily show up on the sheet, but it does affect the quarterback. So I think like that's something to think about here too. And also, I do think Jacob Martin, having played with him, is a guy that does have some pass rush ability, and obviously he's got to make the team. But that's kind of what I would think about. Is like obviously there's the traditional way of thinking about it, where we get two kind of juiced up pass rush ends. Also, we could say, hey, let's go big, compress this pocket, work blitzes, work our middle linebackers rushing. I thought Bobby Wagner did a great job of that last year. I thought Frankie Louvu did a great job of that last year. And we're very productive. And so that's maybe the way, if they don't draft a juiced up pass rusher at 29 or 61, that's probably the direction I would lean in terms of this conversation.
I want to see what version of Javon Kinlaw we get. And when I say what version, this is not me pretending like Javon Kinlaw has at some point in his career thus far been an unbelievable, outstanding pass rusher, football player, like people thought he was going to be coming out of South Carolina. This is going back to something that Adam Peters said yesterday, where he goes, I've seen Kinlaw as low as 275 when he was in San Francisco. And he played at like 350 last year. I've seen him, in San Francisco, he was up as high as 330 at times. And to use Adam's words, quote unquote, he can be chiseled at all of those weights. Like he's just a freak athlete who is very, very capable of changing his body in whatever way he's asked to. And he's like freakishly strong, really quick. Again, some of the discipline and the rush lanes and things like that at times have gotten him in trouble. But if we're talking about him purely as a pass rusher, like where do they decide is optimal for him? Is he going to be playing at 315? Is he going to be playing at 290? And like why and what does that mean for him in terms of rushing inside versus outside versus whatever else? So I think getting Kinlaw out there is a good idea, but I'm also not blind to who he has been so far in his career, where I'd probably say like Newton and Payne deserve to be out there on the inside based off of that. But if we get a new juiced up version of Javon Kinlaw this year, I could certainly make that argument. I think Dorrance is the no-brainer, obviously, on the outside, on one side. And then, I'm very curious to see how they rotate Jacob Martin, Frankie Louvu, et cetera. But if I'm at the, I don't know, if the opponent's at the plus 29 and I'm like, I need a sack to get us out of field goal range, I'm probably bringing a blitz, because that is probably the best way to generate an actual sack type of pressure versus what you're talking about, which is also very effective of like, hey, we don't have that guy that's just going to go necessarily win one-on-one guaranteed if you give him 3 seconds. Let's compress the pocket and see what good things can happen. See if we can force an errant throw, whatever, and just get off the field, or at least force a quick throw that we can rally and tackle. If I need a sack, I'm having Frankie and Bobby come on some kind of cross dog something and trying to get Frankie to time that sucker up. Bobby was awesome last year as a blitzer as well. I think there was some stat they were the only 2 off-ball linebackers that had, or the Commanders were the only team that had 2 off-ball linebackers with 20 plus pressures. I think was the stat. So that's how I'm generating pressure as of right now. If they don't have anybody else.
Yeah, and I do think like one of the things about that pocket compression that I find really interesting is I think when you watch Kinlaw last year, when you watch him rush, man, like, and again, he's not a perfect player by any stretch of the imagination, but when you watch him like turn it on, bring the book, like there are very few people that can physically match him. So the idea of like putting him on the edge and just being like, hey man, like go jack this tackle's, like go end this tackle's life real quick is a relatively appealing proposition to me, to see what that looks like at 315 or 320. And like, again, like last year, there's times where you watch you're watching the best version of what he can be. And you just see him kind of ragdoll these players, ragdoll guards, ragdoll tackles. And it's like, if you can kind of find a way to unlock that, just be like, hey man, I'm not thinking about anything on third down. Like, I just want you running right down. I want you running down this dude's face. Like
See if you can run through the tackle and get to the quarterback.
Yes. Like that's like when I watch his clips, like, I'm like, no one can stop this. Like no one can, if he's locked in on this technique, no one can stop this type of physicality. And so that to me is also very appealing. And I know obviously like this is like kind of where we're not in an ideal world from a personnel standpoint. We're moving people around the front and blah, 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 blah. But I do think like when I hear Adam Peters talk about him and when you watch the film supports it, the high points of the film, again, he's like a yellow player throughout his PFF grade. So, but when you watch the tackles for loss, the sacks, they're dominant physical wins. There's a physicality to them that is very unique. And so to me, like one of the things that's so interesting about the player is like if you can get that to unlock in these pass rushing situations, like that's going to be really, I think about like Montez Sweat in pass rushing situations, a guy that could just, because of his length and size and physicality, could just consistently compress the pocket. And I think you get someone who's a little bit more like twitched up in the hips, like from an explosive kind of throw jump kind of standpoint than Montez. And that's an intriguing proposition to me, you know, coupled with the things we just talked about. So again, I'm not saying he's the solution, but that marriage of the front with Duran and, you know, running games with Duran and Kinlaw, like just violence over there. And Jerzon, the way he was playing with his hands at the end of the year, it doesn't seem like it's as necessary, especially because of the linebacker pressure too. So again, I'm kind of talking myself into this, but I do see a world where you feel very comfortable with that. And again, you need to get the best version of Kinlaw to make that go. But I think if anybody in the NFL can do it, it's this staff.
Yeah.
And I just trust what they can get done with him. So
no, I feel good about that. I also, you know, you got to get better on first and second down so you can be in those third and long situations.
Sure.
And that seems like the bigger concern right now. But a guy like Dietrich Wise, who we didn't really mention there from pass rush juice, like he's going to help in those situations, and we'll see what Johnny is in year 2, et cetera, et cetera.